What's up guys, welcome to the Chess Giant. This is Solomon Erdell, and in today's video we're covering one of the strongest and most famous chess openings of all time with the Queen's Gambit. It starts off with d4 and now against the move d5 we see the Queen's Gambit with c4, and really the whole point of c4 is to use one of our wing pawns and directly fight for the center of the board, specifically this central pawn on d5. So at the beginning of this video, we're going to answer the obvious question. What happens if black just takes the pawn on c4? This may seem like a good move. This may seem like a free pawn, but I actually think that this is a pretty big mistake from black. Following the accepted lines, we're going to cover what to do against the Queen's Gambit declined with e6, as well as the Slav defense with c6, and then we'll be covering some interesting variations like knight f6, which I actually think is a pretty big mistake from black, as well as the move e5 with the crazy Albin counter gambit. A lot of white players fall into trouble against the Albin, but there is nothing to fear. If you know what to do, you're simply going to get a much better middle game position up a pawn. But let's first cover the move d takes c4. Black sees a free pawn and they simply take it. Well, the reason I think taking this pawn is a mistake is now we can take full control right in the center of the board with e4. And just look at these central pawns completely controlling the fifth rank. And now in this position, if black plays a move like e6 or c6 or g6, we're simply going to take that pawn on c4 with tempo, put our knights on c3 and f3, play castling kingside, enjoy a pretty big space advantage, and we're in business. Now what happens if black sees this move bishop takes c4 and doesn't want to lose the pawn by playing a move like b5? Well, against this, guys, we can't play a quiet move like g3 or knight f3. We have to go after this pawn chain right away with the move a4. Now if black takes this pawn on a4, black will temporarily be ahead 2 pawns, but honestly both of the pawns on a4 and c4 we can take whenever we want, and these pawns on a7 and c7 are both isolated and extremely weak. So I really don't think that black should take this pawn on a4, and if the move a6 is played defending the pawn, we can simply take that pawn on b5, and if a takes b5, thank you for the rook on a8. So the best move here is c6, and against this we're simply going to continue putting the pressure on white with knight c3. And I know some of you are probably wondering, wait a second, why can't black just play the move b4, attacking our knight on c3? Well, it may seem like black is playing very aggressively, but honestly both of these pawns are simply overextended and overexposed. We can now play knight a2, attacking both the pawn on b4 and the pawn on c4, and there's really no way for black to defend both. I think if black should defend one, it should probably be this b4 pawn with a move like either a5 or with a move like e6. But against this, we're simply going to even out the material with bishop takes c4. And now if a move like knight f6, we have e5 followed by the move knight f3, really trying to take control and defend these pawns on d4 and e5, which are very strong pawns, making this game difficult for black. Following the move bishop e7, we can simply play a quiet developmental move like bishop d2, really putting pressure on both the knight on d5 and now the pawn on b4 with both our bishop on d2 and knight on a2. So here I think black really does need to play a move like a5, securing this pawn, and now we have a key idea. If you look at white's position here, all of our pieces are pretty active. We have a solid bishop pair on c4 and d2. Our knight on f3 is a good piece, protecting both of these dark squared pawns. The one piece that honestly isn't very good is our knight on a2. And in chess, if you see one of your pieces that isn't very strong, you should either trade it off or make it a better one. So in this position, let's maneuver this knight with the move knight c1 followed by knight b3, putting pressure on both a5 and more importantly reinforcing the central pawn on d4 as well as eyeing the c5 square. We're going to continue with castling kingside, putting a rook on e1, followed by putting our rook on the open file on c1, and white has a very solid game. I would pick white here every single time. So that covers the move b5, defending this pawn on c4. This may seem like a very aggressive and strong move, but now we can simply play a4 followed by knight c3, overextend black's pawn structure, and we're going to enjoy a strategic advantage as well as an advantage in development. Now what happens if black plays one of the 2 main lines of either knight f6, attacking our pawn on e4, or the crazy looking move e5? Let's first cover this knight f6 move, the Alekhine system, attacking our pawn. Against this, we're going to play e5, and really the whole point of this being called the Alekhine system is that black wants to bring their knight to d5, and then following us taking this pawn on c4, playing knight b6. But here we can simply continue with bishop b3, followed by the moves of knight e2, being ready for bishop g4 with the move f3, attacking that minor piece and really making bishop g4 a waste of time. And if the move bishop f5 is played, we can simply continue with knight bc3. But I do think that for white here, this is much better than playing against the Alekhine defense because we have central pawns on e5 and d4, and there's really not much black can do about it. I mean, if black plays a move like e6, we simply continue with bishop e3. We're going to castle kingside, and I absolutely love white's game here. So that covers the Alekhine system with knight f6. We're simply going to play e5, chase this knight to d5, take on c4, continue to naturally develop our pieces, and white has a very simple middle game there. What about the crazy looking move of e5? Now you may want to memorize the rest of this opening line. We do not want to take this pawn on e5, and we definitely do not want to push to d5 in this position. I think the best move is probably knight f3, and I mean, going a move back, we really want to take this pawn on c4 because by doing so, we're putting pressure on the weakest pawn in chess on f7. But the problem with doing this right away is that queen takes d4 can be played. We do not want to allow queen takes d4, so let's play knight f3, forcing the e pawn to take and then take that pawn on c4. This really does remind me of the Scotch Gambit, except that white has more development here. I mean, following the move knight c6, we can simply castle kingside, and in this position, I mean, white really does have some great attacking chances. I mean, even against a move like bishop c5, which looks to reinforce this passed pawn on d4 with two minor pieces and the queen on d8, white can now play the crazy looking move knight g5 in fried liver attack type fashion, using both our knight and our minor piece on c4 to attack that f7 pawn. And really in this position, black needs to defend this pawn, or we're simply going to have a game over because we can take that pawn on f7 and then take that rook on h8. And really there's two ways to defend that pawn, with knight h6 as well as knight e5. And in either case, we're going to sacrifice on f7. What on earth am I talking about? Well, let's first take a look at the move knight h6. Against this, we're going to take on f7 with our knight, attacking both the queen and the rook on h8. So here in this position, I mean, black really does need to take our knight, in which case we can take that knight with check, and following king takes f7 for one mere move, we are simply down a piece, but we have this key idea of queen h5, beautiful move, checking the king and attacking that bishop on c5. Following a move like king g8, we can take that bishop. We're going to continue here with moves like bishop f4, knight a3, knight b5, trying to put some pressure on c7 there. We have a very strong queen on c5. We're going to bring our rooks to d1 as well as c1, and white has a very nice attacking game. I would take white every single time here. I think that any Queen's Gambit player should be pretty happy with this result. So guys, that really covers the Queen's Gambit accepted with d takes c4, which I think is a big mistake because we can simply take full control of the center, take that pawn on c4, and we have ourselves a very nice attacking edge due to our activity of the pieces and advantage in development. Now, what happens if black declines the pawn and plays either the Queen's Gambit declined with e6 or the Slav defense with c6, really trying to defend that centralized pawn on d5. Really, our approach to either of these moves are more or less the same. I mean, starting off with e6, the Queen's Gambit declined. Really, we want to put both of our knights on c3 and f3. This is more or less a universal rule in any of the Queen's Gambit declined variations. I mean, here we can simply play knight c3, followed by knight f3. And now after the move bishop e7, we do have a pretty big decision to make, and that's what to do with our bishop on c1. Do we want to put it on f4, or do we want to play the more aggressive option of g5? Let's first take a look at the move bishop f4. I'm going to be showing you both of these moves, and you can decide which one you like more. I mean, following the move bishop f4, black will probably play a move like castling kingside, and now we can play e3. Now, I do want to mention, against the move bishop f4, black does have the option of playing c5. We're going to cover why bishop g5 stops this idea, but let's first cover the move c6. I mean, black can always play a semi-Slav type position here, playing quiet. What do we do here? Well, now we can play queen c2, and after a move like knight bd7, play h3, and really the purpose of h3 is two-sided. Now, first off, we do defend that square on g4, and on top of that, we create an escape square for our bishop in the case of a move like knight h5, in which case we can simply play bishop h2, reserving our bishop pair followed by a move like g4 attacking that knight. I absolutely love this idea for white. So here in this position, a move like knight h5 really doesn't do a ton for black, so you're probably going to see something like rook e8, in which case we can play a3, supporting a potential b4 push. And now against knight f8, we can continue with bishop d3. And whenever black wants to take the pawn on c4, we can simply take back with our bishop. And now against a move like knight d5, play bishop h2, we're going to play e4, and white has a very nice central advantage. So guys, we just covered the quiet option of c6. What happens against the move bishop f4 if black plays a crazy looking move like c5? I mean, this really does put a ton of pressure right in the center of the board, but when prepared, I do think that white is still completely fine. Here, we're not going to take the d pawn because this knight could centralize, attacking both our knight on c3 and the bishop on f4. This is simply not a good decision for white. Instead, we're going to take the c pawn, and following bishop takes c5, play a3. Now I know some of you are probably thinking, wait a second, why on earth didn't we take the pawn on d5? But in this position, we're actually okay with the tension in the center of the board between both of these pawns. I mean, think about it from the black perspective. If black takes this pawn on c4, I mean, thank you for the pawn. We're going to take this pawn on c4 with a tempo, and if the move d4 is played, we can simply win that pawn. So in this position, black really can't take the pawn on c4 because we simply get our bishop into the game. And if the move d4 is played, well, thank you for the pawn. So now following a move like knight c6, we can play queen c2. And now after the move rook e8, I mean, really with the queen's gambit, guys, we have a ton of flexibility on how you want to play this. We can take the pawn on d5. We can play a move like rook d1, even castling queenside and therefore putting our rook on d1. We can also play a move like b4, kicking that bishop to d6, in which case we'll take that bishop off the board, play c5. And after a move like queen e7, continue with rook d1. We do have some very strong advanced pawns on the queen side of the board, some active knights on c3 and f3, a bishop on f1 that can come to either e2, d3, or b5, pinning that knight on c6 to the rook on e8. White has a very nice game here. So that covers the move bishop f4, which is somewhat similar in some respects to the London system. Now, what about the move bishop g5? By doing this, we're putting direct pressure on this knight on f6. And now following a move like castling kingside, again, we're simply going to continue with e3. And as I mentioned, against the move bishop g5, c5 is no longer possible because of the fact that we can take the c pawn. And now after bishop takes c5, we can take that centralized pawn. And here in this position, as y'all can tell, we have two attacking pieces on that centralized pawn, and black has two defenders, so why not take out one of the defenders here, continue by taking that centralized pawn. And I mean, in this position, we're simply up a pawn, we're attacking that bishop on c5. We have potential bishop e2, bishop d3, or bishop c4 options. We're going to castle kingside, we're simply up a pawn, and I don't think that black has anything to show for it. So again, guys, after the move bishop g5, with us putting pressure on that knight, c5 is really not a good idea for black. I think better is probably knight bd7, in which case we can now continue with rook c1. This is really the main idea behind this bishop g5 move. Play bishop g5, e3, put our rook on c1, get these back rank pieces involved. Following a move like c6, we can play bishop d3, and again, whenever black wants to take the pawn, we're completely okay with that. We'll simply take that pawn back with our bishop, and if a move like knight d5, centralizing our knight and attacking our bishop on g5, we can capture that bishop on e7, continue with a move like castling kingside, e4 ideas are in the air. This is a very quiet and solid position for white, which is very typical of the queen's gambit because here in this position, white really doesn't have any apparent weaknesses. So guys, that really covers the move e6 with the queen's gambit declined. I mean, we're really just going to be playing moves like knight c3, knight f3, putting our bishop on either f4 or g5, continue with e3, keep developing our pieces, and we're just playing chess. Now, what about the move c6 with the Slav defense? I mean, guys, really against this move, our approach isn't changing a ton. I mean, we're going to play knight f3, continue with knight c3, but I do want to mention that we do have one tactical idea, and that's following a move like bishop f5. Sometimes black will play the move c6 because they want to get their bishop involved, but here in this position, black simply did this too early. We're now going to take the pawn on d5 and then play queen b3, attacking both the centralized pawn on d5 and this pawn on b7. I mean, if a move like queen d7, defending both, we can simply play knight e5, attacking that queen, and white is simply winning that position. If a move like b6, we can actually play a crazy move like e4, whole idea being that yes, we're temporarily giving up a pawn, but we want to play bishop b5 with check, pouncing down on the opponent's king, followed by knight e5, really taking control of the light squares, and white honestly in this position is simply winning. I mean, for example, if the move d takes e4, we can play knight e5, and after e6, play bishop b5 with check. And against knight d7, blocking the check, we can now play the crazy looking move g4. I mean, here really the whole idea is that this knight can't leave because we simply win that knight on d7. And if the move bishop takes g4 is played, we can take that pawn on e4, and white is simply crushing black in that variation. And if the move bishop g6, we can now play g5, again, attacking that knight on f6. The knight can't really leave because we simply win that knight on d7. This position is resignable for the black pieces. So guys, that really covers the declined variations, or should I say the good declined variations with e6 or d6, defending that pawn on d5 with one of the pawns. What about the move knight f6? Well, against this move, we're now going to take the pawn on d5. And some of you may be going, wait a second, why are we taking the pawn on d5 now? I mean, against the move c6 and e6, we didn't take the pawn on d5, but now the whole point is that black can't take back with a pawn. Let's first cover the move knight takes d5. Well, against this, we're just going to take a huge edge in the center of the board with e4 attacking that knight. Following the move knight f6, we can continue with knight c3, knight f3, and you guys have seen this before. I mean, we're just going to continue with moves like bishop e3, bishop c4, castling kingside, rook c1, and I love white's game here. So guys, that really covers the option of knight takes d5, in which case we're going to march down the center of the board with e4 taking full control of the center. What about the move queen takes d5? Well, now we simply gain a tempo on the queen with knight c3. I think the best moves for the queen here are probably somewhere like queen d6, queen d8, or queen a5. Against any of these moves, we can play a very natural developmental move like knight f3. And now in this position, following knight c6, we would love to play e4. But the problem with e4 right now is that this knight can simply take it. Our knight on c3 is pinned. So why not play bishop d2, put some indirect pressure on the queen on a5. And here, I mean, a move like bishop f5 may seem to stop the move e4 because both the bishop and the knight attack that square, but we can still play it because following knight takes e4, it's true. We only have one attacker and black has one defender, but following knight takes e4, if black takes our knight, thank you for the queen. This is completely winning for white. So y'all, that covers the move knight f6, in which case we're simply going to take that pawn on d5, against knight takes d5, play e4, and against queen takes d5, play knight c3. White really has nothing to worry about there. What about the move e5 with the Albin counter gambit? I thought we'd wrap this video up with this variation because honestly, especially in online chess, you're probably going to see this variation quite a bit, and this is very hard to play against. I mean, white may be tempted to take this pawn on d5, but against that, black can centralize the queen, putting pressure on d4 with both the queen and the pawn. I really don't like this move for white. I think better is taking the pawn on e5, and now from black, 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 times out of 100, you're going to see black play d4. And it's very tempting here for white to play the move e3, but do not play this move. I repeat, do not play e3. Against this, black has potential bishop b4 check ideas, and it's very hard to play this position as white. Honestly, after the move e3, I prefer black. I think better here is simply playing knight f3, attacking the pawn while simply developing one of our minor pieces. We're now actually threatening to take the pawn on d4. So following the move knight c6, we're now going to play a3, preventing this bishop from coming to b4, and on top of that, preparing to play b4 ourselves. We're now going to continue by fianchettoing our bishop, and this is really the main idea that I recommend playing against the Albin counter gambit. I mean, just take that pawn on e5, play knight f3, continue with a3, b4, and bishop b2, and now in this position, we have 2 minor pieces and a queen all attacking that centralized pawn, and there's really nothing black can do to save that pawn. I mean, following a move like knight c takes e5, we can simply take that knight off the board, play bishop takes d4. In this position, we're simply up a pawn, and black really doesn't have a ton to show for it, if anything at all. White is simply winning in this position. If you'd like to learn more on the theory behind the old Benoni defense, a strong response against the move d4, click the video to the left. If you'd like to learn more about the Owens defense, a fun and strong chess opening for black against the move e4, click the video to the right. Leave a comment to let me know what other videos you'd like to see covered on this channel. And as always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching. Peace.